It was kind of the worst of times, and some degree it was also the best of times because out of all of that just absolute horror, I saw something remarkable in the city was how everyone sort of came together. And if you had the opportunity to help, it was actually quite a rewarding thing to do.
Most modern.
Kevin Kennon is the founder and CEO of Kevin Kennon Architect, Kennon Design Consultancy, and Beyond Zero DDC. He is also the executive director at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. So welcome, Kevin. We are recording this 2 days after 9/11, and when we were doing research on you, one of the things that really stood out was the Ground Zero viewing platform. So can you tell us that story, maybe one or two things that particularly stick out to you?
Yeah, so I live today, even, just a few blocks away from the World Trade Center, just north of it. And, just like everybody, I think I was profoundly affected by that day, on that day, and continue to be affected by it. It was certainly a memorable. It was kind of the worst of times, and some degree it was also the best of times because out of all of that just absolute horror, I saw something remarkable in the city was how everyone sort of came together. And if you had the opportunity to help, it was actually quite a rewarding thing to do. So what happened was a couple days after that, then wife and I went down to view Ground Zero. Now you have to admit, we've gone through this incredibly traumatic thing. Buildings were coming down, clouds of smoke everywhere. People were walking up covered in soot like zombies. It was just the day just unfolded. It just got more and more horrific. So after a couple of days, we thought, well, let's see if we can go down and take a look at what was left of the site. And it was appalling. It was just bedlam of humanity, and people kind of climbing on fences, and guys out there hawking World Trade Center souvenirs, and it was pandemonium. I came back and I was disturbed by that, but yet I also felt like I got it. There's a sort of human need in the face of catastrophe to try to get some kind of understanding of what that was.
Yeah, so I remember like 9/11, there was this huge feeling, I think, across the city of like, how can I help? Like I was 10 years
Right,
old, so there was nothing I could do. Like as an
right.
architect,
Yeah.
how did that feeling manifest for
Well, so, I came back and thought about it, and I said, there's got to be a more dignified way to let people come to terms, physically come to terms. As an
you?
architect, we deal in reality. I mean, most of us. Um, and so, was there a way, of doing that? And I sort of thought, well, okay, maybe we could create some kind of elevated platform for that. And at the time, I was on some kind of committee with David Rockwell, and we got fed up with the committee, and we both walked out at the same time. And we were talking, and I was telling David, he said, well, that's very interesting because I was just approached by the city to do something for the families, to have them have a little dignified thing. I said, no, let's do something in public. We were both friends with Liz Diller and Rick Scafidio, and, they had already kind of written the thesis on, let's, viewing catastrophe. So they were very intrigued about it. So we formed this little group, and we had access to the city, and we basically pitched it to, the mayor, Giuliani, and he liked it. And so,
What was that pitch?
well, we basically came and said that I had already at this point sort of sketched this whole thing out and kind of figured it out, and we had gone back and forth as a group. But I pitched it to him, and the point I was making was the same point I just made to you, was that this pandemonium here. There's got to be some way to allow the public a dignified way of doing that. And we had actually originally designed it as four different ways of getting up on this. And a deputy mayor sort of came up and said, no, let's just do one and let's put it next to St. Paul's Chapel. St. Paul's was a place where a lot of the first responders would go for solace. It was right on the corner of the site and remarkably was completely unscathed. All this debris and all this stuff, the chapel remained, it's if you're spiritually minded, it's a little uncanny. And combined with that, and what people didn't understand was that right behind St. Paul's Chapel was this cemetery, had been there forever, with these very, very tall, I think it was sycamores. And, so the idea of elevating people up at that level, adjacent to the cemetery, adjacent to St. Paul, and adjacent to these magnificent trees, created a completely different perspective. Extremely peaceful. You sort of left the din of the city and went to this incredibly peaceful place. And of course, we built it out of very humble material, plywood and scaffolding, New York scaffolding, very prosaic sort of stuff. And, it was always meant to be temporary. It felt like it was a kind of installation, but it was remarkable in terms of its effect.
Well, it seems like it was this sort of urban transformation. I think a lot of times we imagine New York as a given, that you walk on the crowded sidewalks and you experience the skyscrapers above you. But obviously in a moment of drastic change, unwanted change in this case, you're offering an opportunity to view and experience the city in a new way. And hopefully in that sense, give some solace as you're saying. And I think it doesn't point to the fact that a lot of times architects provide their greatest work when there's a moment of crisis, when people are searching for a new way to envision and to inhabit the built environment. So I know this was a sort of important project for you in your career. What came out of it, and then what did that lead to?
Well, I think there's a couple things I learned in that project, which was the power of architecture, just in the way that you were speaking about, Alex, but also I think in the profound way in which architecture can serve as a platform or framing device and enhance an emotional response. It really is. If you divorce architecture from humanity, you really, in my view, you're not really doing architecture. The two have to be intertwined. And I think, a lot of architects miss that point. We get so caught up in our academic, our images, the kind of social interaction in the studio, whatever reason we become architects, a lot of times we forget that, architecture primarily is a kind of somewhat spiritual enterprise, and it affects people emotionally. And the best architecture, I think, allows people to sort of come to it with whatever baggage they have and leave perhaps somewhat altered, not to get not to oversell what we do, but I think if you just think of it that way, it's life-changing for everyone, and it was certainly life-changing for me because that just got me going on something completely new.
Can you tell us about that something new? Why'd you decide to do it?
I mean, just sticking to ground zero alone. I mean, so I did that, and that was successful. And then I continued to sort of do things around ground zero. One of the things we looked at was doing a project called the Incubator, which was a kind of mixed arts, theatrical arts, art kind of platform, and then an apartment building that was next to it, but it was basically built for the artists.
But I guess before you were mentioning that you were a principal at KPF, right?
Yeah.
Very, very high position, built really great work. But around 9/11, 2001 was when you decided to kind of step out on your own. Like, what made that happen for you? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was the youngest design principal at KPF, and I was, there's some limitations to sort of being in that kind of environment. Actually, KPF is an amazing place. It's a great company. The leadership there was terrific. You know, Bill Pedersen, Gene Cohn, Shelley Fox, they were all amazing people and very supportive and continue to be. Still a great place. But, you know, I had my own ambitions, and that was just the catalyst for that. You know, and again, just the ground zero, did some other things. But then what happened was they had put out this brief for a competition to redesign World Trade Center. I think it was like 800 or 1,000 people, you know, or teams sort of put in with that. I just created my own based with all my friends, you know, which was we formed this group called United Architects, and we had you in studio and, you know, Ben Van Berkel, Carolyn Boss, and Jesse Reiser, and Yanko, and Greg Lynn. And anyway, we had foreign office architects, so Alejandro Saropolo and Farshid. So, you know, we had these were, and all of them were people I knew and had worked with, you know, informally in some way. And so that was a tremendous experience, because that was there's always you hear about collaborative practices, but you know, this was different because this was a collaboration around a single project and a single enterprise, this very intensive kind of conversation. And it was absolutely one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, you know, because people really put their egos at the door. We really worked together, and we you know, decided we would just kind of take on all of these different typologies, you know, from just memorials to how do you build, you know, towers in a new way, and, you know, how do you unify them, and how do you, you know, think of public space in 3 dimensions. There was a lot of thinking and an effort that went into that. And, you know, it was speed. You know, you didn't have a lot of time to just sit around and think of alternatives. You just went with it. Anyway, it was very satisfying, I think.
For our audience who isn't familiar with the architectural competition process, can you talk through what that was like? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about how quickly you have to move, but also this is not a normal competition. This is like the competition of competitions for the first half of the 21st century. This is a big deal.
Well, just to put that into context, this was a competition where, you know, when you presented the project, you were presenting live on television. I don't think that's ever happened. Probably will never happen again. I'm not sure how great television it was, but yeah, it was live on CNN. And I think it just represented the fact that people had been so focused on this and were looking for anything, you know, what's it going to be? How is New York going to pull out of this? But what is our collective aspirations here? Not just for, you know, how are you going to solve the sort of quotidian problem of building again on that site? But, you know, what is this going to symbolize? You know, what is this going to, is literally a kind of phoenix rising from the ashes, or, you know, is it going to be something less? And I think what people forget is the impetus behind that was originally the city and the state, who were controlling the site, and there's a big tension between them, had just gone to, you know, a kind of regular corporate. I won't name who they were, but, you know, he basically to do the sort of planning kind of sort of diagrams and some simple massing of, well, you could put a building here, you could put a building here, you know, solve it in a sort of standard, slightly corporate way. And they made the mistake of presenting those, which were just like block diagrams. And of course, the public doesn't understand the difference between a block diagram and, you know, an actual building. And they were appalled. I mean, people were they had a meeting actually with a public meeting where they eviscerated the city for putting this, well, you know, which actually, yeah, the planning wasn't bad. I mean, you know, from just a strictly planning perspective, but that compelled them to go, well, we got to have a competition. It's got to be Dan Dockeroff, who's the deputy mayor. We have to go and we have to get this. And there were one of five kind of different groups. Daniel Libeskind ultimately won it. But, Norman Foster, there was a kind of the dream team of Eisenman and Richard Meyer, Charles Gwathmey, Stephen Hole. That was a whole nother group. We are actually kind of very close to those guys. So,
But it might be a
during
little
the
bit too inside baseball, but I do want to dig into this. Like when you were just naming names on the team that you assemble, like those are the who's of architects like we learned about in school, right? Like those people competed against each other in most cases, right? But this is a special competition, a special case. So what was it like bringing that team together and how did you get everyone to work together?
I think it helped that I knew everybody. And I was already friends. I had been teaching at Princeton. Ben was there when I was teaching at Princeton. Greg and I knew each other from, he's still one of my closest friends. And Jesse was there too, and Nanako. I think there's just through those kind of connections. And then at the time, I didn't have a studio at that point. I just said, enough with KPF. Fortunately, I had developed a relationship with Thornton Tomasetti and the engineers, structural engineers, and they had an extra space. They just said, "Here, you can take it," and so that was really important because that allowed everybody to sort of import people and collect into one space, which is a complete dump. It was just a hole in the wall kind of place, but we loved it. It was like an instant office and instant like little club, and we treated it that way. That was it. So I think that helped a lot. The energy was off the charts. People were really invested in this, and I think we gave ourselves permission to just go sort of as radical as possible, knowing that the politics of it, and there were a lot of them, were not in our favor. We were just the young kids at that time and, just happy to be there, frankly. But I'm glad we took it. It's one of the things that, it's very satisfying. It was the only project, by the way, that Museum of Modern Art decided to put in their permanent collection. So, it's there. We built this incredible 12-foot tall model that's occasionally they roll it out and, it has its own little location that they don't do it too much just because of the glue. But anyway, that to this day was one of my favorite architecture experiences.
Before we move on from World Trade Center, it's been 24 years, hard to imagine, since 9/11. Just curious if you can comment on the legacy of that development and what's happened in downtown Manhattan since.
Well, it completely transformed. I mean, it was remarkable. People don't realize that when that happened, when 9/11, 2001 happened, before that, it was a ghost town. The financial center was a ghost town. Beautiful if you're an architect, just because all the buildings are so close together and they were mostly pre-war sort of architecture. So it was very different feeling than, say, Midtown, which was mostly glass and more modern. And these were all sort of more traditional stone, but it was desolate. I mean, apart from Wall Street, which is mainly symbolic, and the World Trade Center, which was a kind of isolated island to itself, and maybe the South Street Seaport, but it was pretty empty. So I think that if you go there today, it's a 24/7, 365 day a year, place. People live there, they work there, they play there. It's there's now, of course, the World Trade Center itself. It's missing one or two towers, but those are continually under development. but the Perlman Art Center is now there. The museums are there. The memorials there. So it itself is a remarkable transformation. So I would say it's completely changed in the past 24 years, and in a way that I think everybody had hoped it would change. It's just from a kind of aspirational perspective,
What
thinking
was the
back.
key to that transformation though? Because only one city has gone through a 9/11, but a lot of cities in the subsequent decades have gone through crises.
Yeah,
You've had Katrina in New Orleans.
yeah,
You've had obviously COVID has hollowed out so many downtown cores
yeah,
throughout America and across
right.
the world. So there's similar tremors that are being felt right now. And if
Yeah.
you're a different city, what would you do to stimulate a revitalization in the way that Lower Manhattan was able to?
It's a very good question, and I do think you have to think of it is the energy to do anything starts, I believe, locally. It's hard to think of it as a kind of global like response to tragedy. Each catastrophe, let's take something more recent like the Palisades fire in Los Angeles. And that I grew up in LA in an environment very similar to the Palisades. And I remember, growing up that you're always dealing in ways that you don't in New York, right? In New York, you're dealing with the built environment if you live in the city. In LA, you're dealing with the natural environment, and you're dealing with forces that are, much larger than you. So it's an encounter with nature that is the impetus, for how do you handle that, so obviously climate is a big deal, and other natural forces. And so, it's the way in which you go about it, especially since so much of it's wiped out, is you start to rethink how architecture and nature, kind of come together. And that's a profound thing. And by the way I think about cities, I just think of the built environment as just another natural landscape. It's got nooks and crannies and crevices. And that was essentially, if you boil it down, what that was our proposition as United Architects for our proposal for the World Trade Center. And I think, what I always liked about LA was that all of the classic houses, the Neutras and the Lautners and, all those, amazing buildings, houses mainly, but were built right on the edge, right? A cliff and you're hanging out and just kind of propped up. That type of response to me was always, and it's there. It's actually, if you look at the viewing platform, just to circle back, it's the same kind of thing. It's just, hanging out there, platforms with scaffolding. There's such an interesting response to the natural environment, which is that you can't fight it. It's going things are going to happen. You just have to, you know, do it the best you can. Try to work with the forces that are around you, natural forces and physical ones. And if the shit hits the fan, you just rebuild. You just kind of that's what you do. So it's just a cycle of renewal, and that regenerative cycle to me is a much healthier way of looking at urban design than the ones in which is localized. It's like what's the right thing, what's the right response for a particular environment. It's not necessarily transferable from New York, but if you do your homework and you understand the forces working against you and you respond to that, and I mean that just not only climate forces or nature, but also communal and political forces, frankly, come from a position of humility rather than dominance. I think that, ground up kind of approach, understand and do your research about what makes each place unique and specific, and then try and develop a response based on that.
What I like about our conversation so far is like every time we ask you a question, you kind of take a step back and make us think of things from the bigger picture. You know, as a seasoned architect who's worked in all of these great moments and kind of knows how everything works across the stack, what is one of the big forces that are impacting how architecture is thought of today?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One is that architects have one major problem in society, and maybe it's highlighted particularly in the U.S. because I've been fortunate in being able to work all around the world and work with different cultures. And most cultures respect architects just for being who they are. The U.S., not so much. And I think part of the problem is architects don't know how to articulate their value. You know, we have, unfortunately, the past 2 decades, I think we've increasingly fallen into this trap that we're specialists. And there's been an over specialization in architecture. And as you know, that's our expertise. We're going to sell our expertise and that's how we but the real contribution to architecture, you see these in other societies, is that we're uniquely positioned to be visionaries. You cannot be an architect, or you can't be a design architect in particular. You cannot be a design architect anywhere and practice without being fundamentally an optimist. You're making a bet on the future. And in a society that's scared of the future, that has changes for many people is in itself traumatic. How do you convey that the future is going to be okay? You know, that we're going to make it better even. And unfortunately, I felt like, you know, we've become so overly critical and so even within the academic world, so critical of sort of more utopian kind of propositions, and clearly some of them deservedly so. But I don't, you know, if you take out the hope, you know, for a better tomorrow, you don't really have a lot that you can offer your society. You have to bring people along, and you have to give them a vision to hang on to, so that, you know, and then to me, that's the satisfying thing, is that if you can do that, you can articulate that, and you can obviously convince a client that that vision represents their desires, and so they'll pay for it. And not only that, but everybody involved in whatever it is you're doing will take pride in what they're doing. And to me, that's the most satisfying thing, is when everybody adopts that vision as their own. You know, the ego in architecture is so overrated versus the feeling of satisfaction that you get when everybody basically claims it as their own. That's a great thing. We kind of, you know, overlook that somehow in how we proselytize architecture, and it's unfortunate.
Kevin, this is really striking a chord with me because I think you've put words to a feeling that I've had for a long time, that we've increasingly become pessimistic. We start to only respond to the mundane issues of the world and not try to put forth a better solution. But let me strawman the argument a little bit, which is that, look, we live in a world that's increasingly complex. There's more and more people inhabiting the earth. Things cost more, both from the financial standpoint, but also from social, environmental, and cultural standpoints. And that the margin within which design can operate is getting increasingly narrower and narrower.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, you say we should talk to and we should convince our clients that our visions are worth it. But, you know, how do we square that, especially in the United States, where it's much easier to point to a dollar figure and say, no, it's not in fact worth it. I can get X many of units at a lower quality than if I do fewer units at a higher quality, for instance. Yeah. Like, how do we balance this equation in a moment when everyone is struggling to just make sure the project works?
All right. Well, there's two ways you can go with that, right? One is you just say, you know what? You know, the only people who are going to pay for that are the people who are looking long term. You know, in a world where if you just look at balance sheets and you look at profit motive, why would you invest even in real estate when you can, you know, I think it's the Warren Buffett argument, frankly, you know, which is it's too hairy. There are too many variables, you know, too many people get involved. I can just walk in to my brokerage and look up and I can buy a stock in something and it'll go up, it'll go down. But I can sell it whenever I want. And there's nothing keeping me from doing that if I had the money. But on the other hand, you know, there are people who do invest long term. And there are people, especially if you're talking about multi-generational investment. And also there are people who invest because they care. You know, they care about their community. They care about what happens. And we used to think that would be politicians, you know, maybe less so. You know, that seems to be very driven by kind of narrow news cycle kind of events. And so I can't, I'm not going to propose that I know all the answers to that, but I do think it at least starts by reminding people that there's more to what we have to offer than just, you know, a vehicle for making money. That there are tangible benefits to what we do and pride. I mean, you know, pride is not a bad thing when it comes to communities because it's a powerful emotion. You know, it's a kind of form of love, you know. And I think that given that there's so much hate in the world and divisiveness, you know, we have to make a case for coming together, unifying. Just the World Trade Center is the perfect example. It works. You can do great things together.
Yeah.
So one thing that we like to ask, especially for folks who are like, I guess, well steeped in the world of the built environment, what's one thing maybe the average citizen, someone who's not an architect, can learn or think about that will make their experience in the built environment more enjoyable?
Okay. So the simple answer to that, Lebo, is travel. You know, and I mean, travel can mean anything. You can physically travel, but now we have the ability, you can travel anywhere in the world. You can go on a Google Earth and you can just travel. You can experience, at least visually, you know, if you're doing it digitally, but you can at least begin to experience culture through the lens of architecture. That's what we do. For most of us, when you travel someplace, what do? You go, you know, you're in a city, you go look at buildings. You don't even know that's what you're doing, but you're actually looking at architecture. And I think what happens when people come out of their sort of culture, you're forced to encounter new things on your own terms. Now, you might be not feeling very comfortable. You might need, you know, security in numbers or, you know, what have you, but you're still, if you allow yourself to sort of contemplate, you know, what it is that you're experiencing, and more importantly, to feel what you're experiencing. And if you go someplace and you know you don't know why, it's space in some far distant land, and it takes your breath away, that's architecture.
I think we were having a discussion before we started recording about the value of architectural education, and I think all of us would agree that regardless of if you go on to become an architect or not, architectural education really unlocks your curiosity when it comes to the things around you.
Yeah.
Look up, look down, look all around, read, travel,
Yes.
view things.
Yeah. No, it was funny you brought that up because, you know, I did when I was in my undergraduate, I came to New York and I went to the Institute for Architecture for a year and I studied under Eisenman. And Peter's class began with Palladio, looking at Palladian buildings and, you know, looking at them completely differently. You know, it's sort of, it's hard to describe because you started to understand buildings, how they were put together and some of the relationships and the proportional aspects of them, the kind of mathematics almost or geometries of buildings and how that was almost like looking at a score of music, you know, that had that sort of rhythms and beats and internal structure and harmonics. And, you know, all of a sudden you began to see architecture and the history of architecture as being not unlike the history of music and music itself. That for me unlocked everything because most of us I think can relate to music. Architecture is a little bit more distant, and I think we do way too much to over mystify architecture when actually the best architecture can affect us as profound as a great piece of music, profoundly.
I think that's a beautiful notion, and I think one that I'll definitely noticed more and more that connection between music and architecture is something that I hadn't really thought a lot before. It's definitely not something that came up in our education, Alex. But we're very excited, I think, to ask you our always final question, especially since we have talked about another moment in time that has a really distinct shape and significance, I think, in our lives. If you were to be in the future, say 30 years from now, looking back at our current time, what would you call the time that we're in?
The best of times and the worst of times, which is, by the way, the most beautiful sentence written in the English language. Um, the I live in the future continuously, but I'm fortunate in that I have a very deep well of historic knowledge about architecture that thanks for my education, but also in terms of my practice and my own experience. And so that, to me, that's the one area where the way in which we're going to practice architecture is already changing. We have incredible tools. Lebo, you're already in the sort of tech worlds. What those kind of conversations are about. But there's great promise with AI, I think. And if it's used correctly and just you have to remember it's not your friend. It's a tool. I think can do a much better job of training those tools so it doesn't hallucinate as much. And I think there's a lot of interesting work being done in the problems that we're encountering with AI and how those agents are being trained. So we'll get better at that. But, the real tool for me, the real hope is that we can, just like United Architects, which was bringing a bunch of different practices located all over the world together into one place, we can now do that virtually, just the way you and I are connected. Podcasting for me is a trajectory, for the future, because it's basically, well, you just imagine we were having a podcasting, but we're all working on a project together. And, we're having this and we're having conversations. I find some of the conversations I have on podcasting to be better than conversations I have in real life. I'm not quite sure why, but I do think, just to go back to music again, there's something about the way in which it breaks down the barrier between your sort of exterior presentation of who you are to your interior monologues that I think it has a kind of resonance for a lot of people. I think that's why it they can achieve a little sense of a more profound connection just because they're hearing it between the space between your ears.
Absolutely. I think a little bit of our journey, Lebo and I, on producing this project has been trying to find that medium between just banter and back and forth, sort of kicking the can with your friends, but also the sort of high podium presentation. I think there's a lot of room for conversation that is a bit higher level than just everyday water cooler talk, but at the same time is more free flowing, just like this conversation we've had today.
Yeah. Yeah, so that to me, that's where you see the hope for the future, right? That we can have more distributed practices. I'm a big advocate for project-based teams, not corporate teams. I have the advantage of I know a lot of people in architecture. It is a pretty small world, but I also am a big advocate for younger architects going off on their own on some level, sort of trying new things. And we, as older architects, have a responsibility, I think, to help those behind us, and succeed and to bring them into different projects in a variety of ways. And I think you get just on the whole, everything works better. The business model works better. The outcome works better. And what architects have to learn to do is let go of the sort of kind of Howard Roark brutalist sort of projection and give people credit, in terms of what they do. It's just, I have, have the wherewithal to advocate for a collaborative environment where everybody succeeds. You don't zero sum gains in architecture ultimately don't work.
That's a great statement for us to wrap up on. So if, I'm someone out there listening, I want to find out more about you, I want to maybe come collaborate on one of your projects, how can people find you?
Easiest way is just LinkedIn. Social media is that's easiest. So, all my info and connections are there. So if you just look me up on LinkedIn, my first name actually is Paul. So it's named after my father. They called me Kevin Kennon. It doesn't work in modern world because if you get verified, you have to sort of put in Paul Kevin Kennon. So you can find me on LinkedIn under Paul Kevin Kennon, even though nobody calls me that.
We'll make sure to put the right link in the show
Yeah,
notes.
sure.
But this was wonderful. Thank you so much, Kevin, for indulging us. I think, I got a lot out of this conversation. I'm sure Alex did too. And I hope our listeners did.
Well, I'm a big fan of the podcast, so it's an honor to be here. I thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed our conversation.